I have worked the hot meal counter at Hangar 9 for 11 years. Before that, 22 years as a logistics officer with the Compact Transit Authority, filing manifests, auditing transfer codes, reconciling cargo classifications against compact law. I retired with a commendation and a bad left knee, and the knowledge that no document in the CTA system could surprise me. I took the aid work posting because I needed somewhere to stand after my husband died, and the relay station at Morn seemed like the kind of place where a woman my age could be useful without anyone expecting heroics. You feed people. You keep records. You go home at the end of shift and you do not carry the work with you. That was the plan. The child was sitting beside the locked door at the far end of the holding wing when I arrived for the early shift, a Tuesday in the third week of autumn. The corridors still cold because the heating grid on that level ran about 40 minutes behind the shift schedule. She was small Keth, I thought, from the ridge ears and the ash-gray skin, and she was sitting very straight with both hands in her lap, holding a small carved bird. Not crying, not rocking or looking for someone. Just sitting there with the patience of a thing that has learned not to expect anyone to come. I noticed her the way you notice a wrongly filed form, something placed in a category it doesn't belong in. The holding wing was a transit space. Families, single travelers, refugees awaiting processing, that was the expected population. Children moved through it attached to adults, a small child sitting alone with that specific stillness. The stillness of a child who has been told to stay and has been staying for a very long time was not the expected population. I set down my supply bag and walked over. She looked up at me. Her eyes were pale amber, very large, and they had that quality some Keth eyes have of seeming lit from slightly inside, a faint warmth behind the iris like firelight behind a thin stone wall. She did not speak. The Keth are not mute, but the young ones communicate mostly through small gestures and the particular angles at which they hold their ridge ears. And this child's ears were pressed flat, not afraid, exactly, but held with the care of someone who has decided that the safest posture is the smallest one. I crouched down, my knee announced its objections. I ignored it. "Hello," I said, in the trade dialect that served as the common tongue at Morn. "Are you waiting for someone?" She showed me the carved bird. It was a good piece of work, the wingspan exact, the grain of the wood following the line of the tail feathers. Someone had made it for her, someone who paid attention to things. "That's lovely," I said. She turned it over in her hands, looking at it the way children do when they are deciding whether an adult is safe to believe. Then she held it out toward me, not offering it, I understood, but showing it. "This is mine. This is real. This is the thing I have." I nodded seriously, the way you accept an important document. "My name is Vera," I said. "I work in the kitchen. I was about to make tea. Would you like some?" She looked at the door at the far end of the hall, still locked, looked back at me. Then very carefully she stood up, and I saw that she had been sitting on the carry strap of a small bag, not a bag packed for a child, but a standard transit document bag, the kind the processing clerks used, with a paper tag wired to the handle. A classification tag. I saw the field heading before she stood fully and blocked my view. Registered transfer, unaccompanied dependent unit. I kept my face still. "Come on then," I said, and she came. The kitchen in Hangar 9 was a prefab setup behind the counter, 2 burners, a filtration unit, enough shelf space for dry goods and condiments, a small table where the overnight staff ate. I made tea for myself and heated water with a little honey concentrate for her, because Keth children at that age didn't take the tannins well, and I set it in front of her and I sat across from her and I looked at the document bag. She had put it in her lap again, both hands around it, the carved bird balanced on top. I had seen the field heading, registered transfer, unaccompanied dependent unit. I knew what that classification meant because I had spent 22 years with the CTA, and I had helped write the updated commentary on Compact Transit Code Section 14, Article 9, which was the provision governing the movement of unaccompanied minor dependents across compact regulated space. I knew, specifically, what the difference was between a dependent unit registered under a care sponsor arrangement and a dependent unit registered under a commercial transfer arrangement. I knew what documentation was required for each. I knew how the forms had been designed and what gaps existed between the letter of the requirement and its intent, because I had attended the working group sessions where those gaps were identified and flagged, and I had watched the working group decline to close them on the grounds that the process would be burdensome for legitimate transit operators. I had flagged it in writing, in a memo that was filed and acknowledged and not acted upon. I thought about that memo while the child drank her honey water and the carved bird sat on the table between us, and I thought about how many children might have passed through how many processing desks in the 11 years since I had filed it. "What's your name?" I asked. She pointed to the tag on the document bag. There was a field for it. Next to Dependent Unit ID, which was a number, there was a name field, and in the name field someone had written, in small, neat administrative letters, the word KESS. "Cass," I said. She looked at me. The ears shifted fractionally, not pressed flat anymore but not relaxed either, something in the middle, recognition. "Kess," I said again, and this time I said it the way you say a name, not the way you read a label, and she straightened a little, and I understood that no one had said it to her that way in some time. The door at the end of the hall was locked. I did not yet know who held the lock. I did what I always do when I encounter a wrong document. I started pulling the thread. The station's processing manifest was accessible from the kitchen terminal. Aid workers had read access to the transit log as a matter of course, so we could coordinate meal distribution with expected population counts. I pulled up the current day log while Kess finished her honey water. The holding wing had 11 registered occupants this morning. 10 of them were adult Keth, filed under refugee pending verification. The 11th was listed under the commercial transfer queue. Unaccompanied dependent unit transfer ref. CT 994214A status, awaiting broker confirmation. Broker of record, Haveth Transit Solutions Limited. Est. Transit completion, 900 this shift. It was 6:12. I did the arithmetic. 2 hours and 48 minutes until a broker showed up to complete that transfer. And I did not yet know where the transfer was going, because destination data on commercial transfers was not in the read access tier. It was in the restricted manifest, behind a clerk authorization. I looked at Kess. She had turned the carved bird over and was running her thumb along the underside of the wing, the way you do when you are remembering the hands that made something. I picked up my station ID and walked to the processing desk. The overnight clerk was a young man named David who I had known for 4 years, since he was 18 and newly hired and had eaten my soup 3 times a week while he learned the job. He was not corrupt. He was tired. Those are different problems. Morning Vera, early shift again. Always. David, I need a destination pull on a commercial transfer. CT 994214A. He looked at his screen. That's restricted access, your aid worker tier. I know what tier I'm on. I'm also a former CTA logistics officer with 22 years of service and a filed incident report on this exact transfer class from 2015. I'm not asking you to break protocol. I'm asking you to make a professional judgment call on whether there's a welfare reason to pull restricted data, which is a provision that exists under Station Regs 742, because the people who wrote the welfare provision understood that aid workers sometimes need to know things before a transfer completes. That's not a loophole, David. That's the system doing what it's supposed to. He looked at me the way the young look at the old when they are deciding whether the old person knows what they are talking about. I waited. I had the patience of 11 years behind a counter. "What's the welfare concern?" he said. Unaccompanied Keth child, estimated age 3 to 5. No visible guardian. No care sponsor documentation on the surface record. Broker I don't recognize. It's 6 in the morning and she's been sitting alone in the holding wing long enough that the heat grid wasn't running yet when she sat down. He pulled the destination. Work Colony 7, RIN Sector. Labor Support Contract Standard Term. Dependency Class Developmental. Developmental. That was the CTA's taxonomy for children too young for formal labor assignment, but old enough to be placed in a dependency service arrangement, which was a category that existed, officially, to cover genuine family relocations to work colonies, where children naturally accompanied parents. What it had become, in practice, in the years since the working group had declined to close that gap, was the mechanism through which children without traceable guardians were moved into work colony populations and assigned care dependency costs that converted at majority to labor obligations. You arrived as a child. You were fed and housed in the colony's dependency system. At 15, you owed the colony those costs. The debt was carefully calibrated to require approximately 12 years of labor to discharge. It was not technically slavery. Every CTA legal review had said so, including the ones I had contributed to. It was, technically, a dependent care arrangement followed by a voluntary labor agreement signed by the dependent upon majority, which was legal because at majority they were no longer children and could sign labor contracts. The carved bird sat in the kitchen with a small Keth girl who had been given it by someone who paid attention to things. And in 2 hours and 40 minutes, a broker was going to arrive and take her to work Colony 7 on a developmental dependency contract, and she was going to grow up in the colony system, and at 15, she was going to sign a piece of paper that was going to look like a choice. I thanked David and walked back to the kitchen. Kess was still there. She had finished her honey water. She was looking at the carved bird and she was very still, and I thought about what it means to be still that way, not peaceful, but practiced. The stillness of someone who has learned that drawing attention makes things worse. I sat down across from her. "I'm going to make some calls," I said. "It might take a while. Will you wait here with me?" She looked at me, the amber eyes. Then she set the carved bird down on the table between us, pointing at me, not giving it to me, pointing it at me the way you point someone toward a direction. I understood. I went to work. The first call was to the Compact Child Transit Welfare Office, which had a regional contact number and an automated intake system that triaged calls by severity code. I had memorized the severity tiers in 2015 when I was writing the Section 14 commentary, and I knew which tier would put a call into a human queue before 900 rather than into the overnight review pile. I filed it under Tier 2, imminent transfer, citing the specific provision that required a welfare hold on any commercial transfer of an unaccompanied minor pending verification of care sponsor documentation. The automated system acknowledged the filing and advised response within 4 business hours. 4 business hours. The transfer was in 2.5. I moved on. The second call was to the Morn Relay Station Commander's office, specifically to the duty officer's line, which I knew was staffed around the clock because I had been eating meals in this station for 11 years, and I knew which lights were on at which hours. I told the duty officer, a woman named Chelen, whom I had fed soup to approximately 300 times, that I had a welfare flag on a commercial transfer scheduled for 900, and that I was requesting a voluntary administrative hold pending documentation review. Chelen said she'd have to escalate. I said please escalate promptly and I would wait. While I waited, I looked at the broker documentation in the commercial transfer queue. Haveth Transit Solutions Limited. I pulled the company registration, 3 years old, registered in the RIN sector. Previous filings, 46 commercial transfers of dependent units over the past 2 years, all developmental classification, all bound for work colonies in RIN. 46. I thought about that number. I went back to the Section 14 documentation. Here is the thing about bureaucratic systems. They are written by humans, which means they contain the traces of every argument that was ever had about them. Every provision reflects a debate. Every gap reflects a decision. When I had flagged the gap in Article 9 in 2015, the working group had recorded its deliberations, which were accessible in the archived commentary. I pulled those deliberations now. 3 senior transit advisors had argued in writing that the distinction between care sponsor and commercial transfer classifications needed a verification requirement at point of origin, not just at point of destination. The working group had declined because destination verification was already required, and adding an origin check would slow transit times for legitimate family relocations. But here was the trace of the argument. In the archived commentary on that vote, the working group chair had written, for the record, that the distinction between a genuine care sponsor arrangement and a commercial developmental transfer should be determinable by the presence or absence of a specific form, Form CTA 14A7, the Guardian Release and Custody Transfer Certification, which was required under a different article, and which, under that article's requirements, had to be filed at origin and attached to the travel document before the transfer entered the transit system. The commercial transfer record for CT 9942 14A did not contain Form CTA 14A7. It contained a reference to Form CTA 14A7 with a file number, which is what the processing system generated when a form was supposed to be attached. But when I pulled the file number, the document it returned was a blank template with a timestamp from 18 months ago and a watermark that said draft. A draft form, not a completed form. The processing system had accepted the reference number and flagged the transfer as document complete because it had a number on file in the right field. No one had opened the attachment. The system didn't open attachments automatically. It checked for the presence of a reference number and moved on. 46 transfers, all with document complete status. I would have bet everything I owned that not one of them had a completed Form CTA 14A7. While I waited for Chellan to call back, I sat with Kess at the small table and watched the station come alive around us. Morn Relay ran 3 shifts, and the overlap between overnight and early was its own brief weather, the outgoing crew carrying the particular exhaustion of people who had been patient all night, the incoming crew still cold from the transit corridors, everyone moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who had done this enough times that efficiency was all they had left in the early hours. I had watched that overlap happen 11 times a year for 11 years, and I still found it settling. There was something right about work being handed off with care. Kess watched it too. She had turned on the stool to look through the pass-through at the main counter area, and she tracked the movement of people with the quiet attention of a child who has learned that watching is safer than being watched. Her ridge ears shifted in small increments, not fear-flat, but moving, reading the room. The Keth were deeply perceptive in crowds. Their ear-ridge nerves picked up subsonic vibrations that humans couldn't detect, so they read the emotional temperature of a space from something more than faces. I had learned that at morn from a Keth refugee liaison named Orphan, who had spent 2 years explaining his species to me in exchange for extra bread at lunch. Whatever Kess was picking up from the early shift handover, her body language suggested she had decided, tentatively, that this particular room was not dangerous. That was more than she'd offered the holding wing. I pulled up the prior 46 transfers while I waited, and I went through them systematically. All developmental class, all RIN sector work colonies. The destination colonies rotated across 4 sites, not one colony absorbing them all, which was careful. 4 sites made the pattern less visible in any individual colony's population records. The intake windows were also staggered, not all in the same month, spread across the year in clusters of 4 to 8. Someone had designed this carefully. Not carelessly, not greedily, carefully. The kind of careful that knows what the audit triggers are and stays below them. That kind of careful made me angrier than sloppy criminality would have. Sloppy meant opportunistic. This was architectural. Someone had sat down and engineered a structure that used the CTA's own legal gaps as load-bearing walls. The working group's decision not to add origin point verification had been their foundation. My unacted-upon memo had been their reassurance that the gap wasn't going to close. I turned off that line of thinking. It was not useful yet. Later, maybe, not now. Chelin called back. The station commander was not on shift, she said. The deputy commander was reviewing my request. Tell the deputy commander, I said, that I have identified a documentation deficiency in the source filing that under Section 14, Article 9, Subsection 4, Paragraph 3 of the Compact Transit Code constitutes a mandatory processing hold. I am not requesting a discretionary administrative pause. I am notifying the station that the transfer as filed is not in compliance with the Compact Transit Code and cannot be legally completed in its current form. I would like the deputy commander to note that notification in the station log, timestamp this moment, and issue a hold confirmation to the broker. A pause. Vera, you're a cafeteria worker. I am a retired CTA logistics officer, grade 7, with 22 years of service and a specialty certification in transit code compliance. I took a job running a food counter. The two things are not mutually exclusive. Please ask the deputy commander to note that I hold credentials under CTA Charter Annex 12, which authorizes former CTA officers to formally flag compliance violations as named civilians even after separation from service. Another pause, longer this time. I'll relay it, Chelin said. Kess had moved from the table to the counter. She was standing on the bottom rail of one of the stools, looking at the shelf where I kept the dry goods, specifically at a canister of the salt grain crackers I handed out with soup. She was looking at it the way children look at food that they want very much but have learned not to ask for. Help yourself, I said. She turned to look at me, checking. It's all right, I said, go ahead. She took 3 crackers and sat back down with them and the carved bird, and she ate each cracker in small, careful bites, and the sight of that carefulness, the tiny rationing instinct of a child who has learned that there might not be more, sat behind my sternum like a coal. I kept working. I filed the formal compliance notification under my CTA Annex 12 credentials. It was not a call, not a request. It was a filed document, timestamped, citing the specific code provisions, naming the transfer reference, identifying the deficient documentation, and formally flagging that the station's processing desk had accepted a draft form in place of a completed form, which was a processing error that carried liability implications for the station under CTA audit protocols. I addressed copies to the station commander's office, the Compact Child Transit Welfare Office, the CTA Regional Compliance Desk, and the broker of record, Haveth Transit Solutions, Limited. When you work in logistics for 22 years, you learn how to write a document that cannot be easily set aside. You learn the specific citation format that makes it part of the official record. You learn that the phrase for the record at the beginning of a sentence does something different in an official document than in a conversation. You learn that a timestamp notification filed in triplicate is a different kind of object than a phone call from a concerned citizen. I had been filing documents since before the broker of record was born. The deputy commander called at 7:42. Ms. Casson, I've reviewed your filing. We're placing a voluntary administrative hold on the transfer pending documentation review. Thank you, I said. I would also request that you note in the hold documentation that this is not a discretionary pause, but a mandatory hold under Section 14, so the broker cannot challenge it as a station-level interference with a lawful commercial transfer. The wording matters. A pause. I'll have the clerk amend the wording. Thank you, and one more thing. I have 45 prior transfer references under the same broker that I'd like the compliance desk to pull documentation for. Same issue may apply. Same form. A longer pause. I'll need to escalate that. I know, I said, please do. I put down the terminal and sat with Kess for a while, and did not do anything except drink my tea and watch her turn the carved bird over in her hands. The morning was coming in through the high hangar windows, the kind of pale, flat light that morn got in autumn, and it fell across the counter in a way that caught the grain of the carved wood and showed the detail of the maker's work. The fineness of the tail, the weight distributed right, the wings angled for a rising current, not a glide. Who made it? I asked. She looked at the bird. Then she pressed one ear flat, just one, and tilted her head. I had read enough about Keth body language in my years at Morn to know that that gesture, that specific ear angle with the head tilt, meant something like, someone who is gone now. Not dead, necessarily. Keth used a different gesture for death. But gone. Absent. Someone she was no longer near. Someone who loved you, I said. She looked at me. Something crossed her face, not tears. The Keth don't cry the way we do, but a tightening, a kind of held thing, and she put both hands around the bird and held it the way you hold a weight you have been carrying for a long time and are not going to set down. I nodded. I did not push it further. At 8:51, the broker arrived. He was a compact man in his 40s, well-dressed in the transit business style, carrying a document case and the expression of someone accustomed to stations and waiting areas and the mild friction of bureaucratic delay. He came to the processing desk first, as they do, and Davitt told him there was a hold. I watched through the kitchen pass-through. The broker's expression did not change much. A slight tightening, a recalibration, the look of someone who has encountered holds before and expects to move through them with the right documentation. He asked to speak with the station compliance officer. The compliance officer on duty was a young man named Ferris who had been in the role for 8 months and who, to his credit, had reviewed my filing carefully before the broker arrived. Because when the broker was brought to his desk, Ferris opened with the specific documentation deficiency, Form CTA 14A7, incomplete, rather than waiting for the broker to lead. I could not hear the conversation from the kitchen, but I watched the broker's posture shift when Ferris cited the form number. A small shift. The recalibration of someone who expected a different kind of obstacle. He produced documents from the case. Ferris reviewed them. The back and forth took 11 minutes by the counter clock. I watched through the pass-through without appearing to watch, the way you do when you do not want someone to know how closely you are tracking them. The broker remained calm throughout. That was professional. Whatever he was experienced at this particular kind of friction, the compliance desk, the hold, the request for documentation, and his body language said that he had done this enough times to know that documentation solved holds. You produced the form. The clerk reviewed the form. The form was complete. The hold dissolved. That was how it was supposed to work. He was not wrong that the form was complete. He was wrong about what the form meant. Then Ferris came to the kitchen. Ms. Casson, the broker says he has a completed form CTA 14A7. He wants to know on what basis your filing supersedes his completed documentation. Can I see the form? Ferris brought it to me. I read it carefully, start to finish, all 7 fields in the signature block. It was complete, all fields filled, properly formatted, signed and countersigned. The child's name in the subject field matched the tag on the document bag. The signatures were from a guardian release authority in the RIN sector, dated 14 months ago. The authority code was formatted correctly. The transfer purpose matched the commercial transfer classification. Everything in the document was in order. That was the first thing I established. The form was real. not forged. A forged form would have been easier to catch and easier to prosecute, and whoever built this system was not interested in easy problems. I looked at the Guardian's registry number in the signature block and wrote it down. "Thank you," I said. "Tell the broker I need 15 minutes." He went back. I heard the broker's voice from the hall measured, even the tone of a man making clear that 15 minutes was a professional courtesy he was extending. He had not raised his voice once. I noted that. It told me something about how many times he had done exactly this: produced the paperwork, waited for the clerk to review it, moved on. I pulled the Guardian registry. The number in the signature block returned a registration for a foster care authority in the RIN sector, legitimate, licensed, operating since 7 years ago under a regional welfare charter. The authority had a clean inspection record, no complaints filed against it, no adverse findings. On paper, it was exactly what it claimed to be. I pulled its transfer history. In the past 2 years, this authority had issued 31 Guardian release certifications. All 31 had gone to Haveth Transit Solutions. All 31 were developmental class dependent units. All 31 were bound for work colonies. I sat with that number. 1 foster care authority. 2 brokers, no, 1 broker. Haveth was the only receiving party. 31 certifications in 2 years. All to the same destination class. I pulled the RIN sector foster care records to cross-reference. The authority had 11 children registered in its care at this moment. Over the previous 2 years, it had registered a total of 31 children, each one transferred to Haveth within 3 to 6 weeks of initial registration. The registration created the legal status. The status enabled the Guardian release. The release enabled the commercial transfer. The transfer completed the pipeline. The foster authority did not exist to care for children. It existed to create the documentation that allowed children to be moved. 3 to 6 weeks of registration time, just long enough to establish a legitimate-looking care record, not long enough for anyone to notice that no child ever stayed. The inspection record was clean because inspections happened on a schedule, and the schedule had gaps in it, and the children moved through the gaps. I thought about who had designed this. Not a careless person. A careful, patient, methodical person who understood the CTA regulatory architecture well enough to use its compliance mechanisms as camouflage. Who knew that a completed form CTA 14A7 from a licensed authority would dissolve a processing hold at 95 stations in 100. Who knew which 4 work colonies were below the audit trigger thresholds for population intake. Who had worked out, probably on a spreadsheet, the optimal transfer cadence to keep the numbers invisible. This was not opportunism, this was engineering. I went back to Ferris. "The documentation clears the individual form requirement," I said. "My compliance hold stands on a different basis. I need you to note in the station log that I am formally identifying this transfer as part of a pattern of transfers sharing the same broker, the same Guardian release authority, and the same destination classification, and that I am requesting a welfare review of the pattern under CTA Charter Section 22, which covers systemic transit violations as distinct from individual transfer violations. That is a different review authority. The individual form doesn't discharge the systemic flag." Ferris stared at me. He was 26 years old and had been in the compliance role for 8 months. "I don't know if I have the authority to." "You have the authority to file the flag," I said. "You don't adjudicate it, the regional compliance desk does. Your job right now is to note it and forward it. That's within your authority. The hold on this transfer remains in place until the regional desk has reviewed it, because a systemic flag under Section 22 carries an automatic hold on all transfers within the named pattern." He looked at the document case. He looked at the broker waiting in the hall. He looked at me. Is this going to go somewhere?" he said. "Or is it going to get filed and nothing happens?" I looked at him. He was young and he was trying, and that mattered. I don't know, I said. I genuinely don't know. I know that 32 children went through that pipeline in the past 2 years and 31 of them are in work colonies in the RIN sector right now. I know that a Section 22 flag goes to the Regional Compliance Desk and from there to the CTA Inspector General's office, and that the IG's office has enforcement authority. I know that what we do in the next hour will be in the official record either way. Past that, I can't tell you what happens. But what we do right now, that part I can control. Ferris went back to his desk. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched through the pass-through as he relayed the Section 22 flag to the broker. Watched the broker's face this time, not just his posture. He was good at this. The expression barely shifted. A tightening around the eyes, a slight pause before he responded, a single glance at the document case as if checking whether he had something in there that addressed the new obstacle. He didn't. A Section 22 systemic flag was not a form you could produce a form for. It was a category change. It moved the matter from one desk to a different desk with different authority. He said something to Ferris. Ferris said something back short. The broker nodded the nod of a professional accepting a delay and went to the waiting area. I went back to Kiss. She had finished the crackers. She was sitting with the carved bird in both hands, watching me with the patient amber eyes. "It's going to be a longer morning than I expected," I said. She set the bird down and pointed it at me again. I almost smiled. The broker waited 2 hours. I know because I was watching the time. He was polite, professionally so. He sat in the waiting area and he made calls on his own terminal and he did not raise his voice. Twice he came back to the processing desk. Twice Davitt told him the hold was in place and the regional desk had been contacted and there was nothing to do but wait. He received both of these updates with the equanimity of a man who has learned that patience is a professional asset. I had no particular feeling about him as a person. I have noticed over the years that people expect you to feel something vivid about those who do wrong: contempt, or rage, or a sharpened focus that comes from knowing the shape of the enemy. I felt none of those things. I felt the same things I feel when I encounter a bad filing, a kind of neutral clarity, the interest of a problem that needs solving. He had built a structure that worked because nobody had sat down and mapped its architecture. I had sat down and mapped it. That was the whole transaction between us. What I felt about the 31 children already in the work colonies was different. That I did carry, but it was not the hot kind of feeling. It was the cold, close kind, the weight you pack carefully and do not set down. At 11:12, the CTA Regional Compliance Desk called the station directly. I was not in that call, but Ferris found me afterward, coming into the kitchen with the look of a young person who has just understood something about their job that they had not understood that morning. The regional desk had received my Annex 12 filing, my Section 22 flag, and a forwarded copy of my 2015 memo, which I had attached as supplementary context, not because I expected anyone to feel bad about not acting on it, but because the memo established a documented prior identification of the gap, which made the systemic flag harder to categorize as a one-off concern. The regional desk had assigned a compliance investigation officer. The transfer was on formal hold pending investigation. "They want your contact information for the investigation," Ferris said. "I'll file it with them directly. Give me their reference number." They asked if you had the previous transfer references, the 45. "I'll provide them. Tell them I have documentation on all of them." He nodded. Then he said, "The broker asked to know the name of the person who filed the flag." "That's public record," I said. "My name is on the Annex 12 filing." He nodded again. I watched the broker leave. His posture had changed, not angry, not volatile, just carrying a different kind of weight. The weight of a man who has run a pipeline and now knows someone has traced the pipe. I hoped the IG's office would find all 31. I went back to the kitchen. Cass was still there. It was after 11 now, and the morning rush had come and gone, and my counter assistant, a teenager named Bry, had arrived for the midday shift and was looking at Kess with a kind of uncertain confusion. "She's with me," I said. "Is she? Should I call processing?" "Processing has been notified. She's under a welfare hold. That means she's here until the welfare officer arrives for the intake interview." Bry nodded and started on the lunch prep and left Kess to me, which was the right instinct. Bry was 17 and good-hearted, and had no idea what to do with a small alien child who watched everything and said nothing. And the right thing when you don't know what to do is to do the task you're supposed to do and let someone else handle what they know. I made lunch for Kess, not crackers this time, but a proper bowl of the grain soup I served to the morning crowd, with a piece of soft bread on the side, the kind that didn't need chewing force. Keth's children at her age had teeth, but their jaw muscles weren't fully developed yet. I had learned that from the same Keth liaison who taught me the ear gestures. She ate the soup slowly, still with that careful rationing rhythm, and the bread she held in both hands and ate in small, deliberate pieces, and the carved bird sat at the edge of the table where she could see it. I sat with her, not talking much. She didn't seem to need talk. She needed to be in a room where nothing unexpected was going to happen, and I could give her that. She had been through something I did not have the full shape of yet, the displacement, the separation. However, she had ended up in the transit system tagged as an unaccompanied dependent unit. However, she had ended up with that document bag. I did not ask. There would be time for the welfare officer to do the intake interview properly, with an interpreter in a setting designed for it. My job this morning was to be steady, to keep her fed and calm, and to work the documents. That was the division of labor. What I thought about while I sat with her was the holding wing. She had been in that corridor since before the heating grid came up, at minimum since 4:30 in the morning, possibly earlier. 8 hours, maybe more, sitting straight, both hands in her lap, holding the bird. Whatever had put her in that corridor, she had been alone in it for a very long time, and she had not screamed, had not run, had not done what children often do when they are frightened and alone in a strange place. She had sat with her back straight and her hands still and waited, because she had already understood at her age that the kind of stillness that does not draw attention is the safest kind. I found that harder to sit with than the document work. I sat down across from her and I had nothing left to file for now, and so I just sat. The station was going about its business. The heating grid had caught up. The light through the high windows was brighter now, midday light, and it came across the counter and caught the bird again, and I looked at the workmanship, the care of it, the attention, and I thought about the person who had made it. "She'll be looking for you," I said, guessing. The gesture she'd made, not dead but gone, someone separated from, not lost. Kess turned the bird over. Her expression was the held, careful thing again. "The welfare office will try to find her," I said. "That's what the intake process is for. It's not fast, I won't lie to you about that. But it exists. There are people whose job is to trace the separation." She looked at me. She was 3 or 4 or 5. I could not tell precisely. The Keth's age markers were different from human ones. And she was old enough to understand words in the trade dialect, and young enough that she was choosing whether to believe me based on something other than words. She picked up the carved bird and held it out to me, both hands. This time it was an offering. I took it carefully, felt the weight of it, light, dry wood, smooth from handling, turned it over the way she had shown me, along the underside of the wing. And there in the wood I felt rather than saw marking letters, shallow carved, the kind a careful hand makes with a very small blade. I angled it toward the light. A name. 2 words in the Keth script that I had a working read of from years at Morn, carved small and precise into the wood. The child's name in full, and below it another name. The Makers. I sat with that for a moment, the attention of it. Someone had carved her name into the bird she carried, in case she forgot it, in case someone else tried to give her a different one. Her name is in the record, I said. Kess, I put it there myself this morning, and I'll make sure the welfare officer sees this. Both names. She was watching me, the amber eyes. I gave the bird back and she received it with both hands and held it the way she had been holding it all morning, and I thought, this child knew someone good. Whatever the pipeline had done, whatever the transit system had done, she had been loved by someone who paid enough attention to carve a name in wood so small it could only be read in the right light. The welfare officer arrived at 1340. She was a compact woman with an official lanyard and the look of someone who had seen a great many intake cases and was still doing the job anyway, which is its own kind of steadiness. She reviewed my filing, the holds, the Section 22 flag. She interviewed Kess gently, through a Keth dialect interpreter they brought in via screen, the kind of patient interview that child welfare requires. Kess was cooperative. She showed the officer the bird. The officer photographed it, both names. I gave a statement and filed it in the official record. Everything I had done since 6/12, every call, every document, every citation, all of it in the record, time-stamped, named. The welfare officer read through it without comment, the concentrated silence of someone building a picture. When she finished, she looked up at me and said, "This is thorough." I said thank you and did not add anything to it, because thorough was what the situation required, and there was nothing remarkable about doing what a situation requires. That was the point. The point had never been to be the one who stopped it. One person, one morning, one transfer. That was not how you stopped a pipeline. You stopped a pipeline by making a record that was too complete and too formally correct for the IG's office to set aside. You made a record that required a response. The response would come from people with more authority than me, and it would take longer than a morning, and it would reach further than I could reach from a soup counter. But it would only come if the record was there. The welfare officer took Kess to the station's welfare suite for interim care. Before she led her away, Kess stopped at the kitchen counter and looked at me. I was cleaning down the surface, standard end-of-midday routine. I looked back at her. She held up the carved bird. Then she pressed it briefly against her chest, both hands, a Keth gesture I had learned meant something like, safe now, or maybe, keeping it safe. The gesture had that double meaning. I nodded. She went with the welfare officer. I finished cleaning the counter. The IG investigation took 7 months. I know because they kept me in the record as a named civilian complainant, and they were required to notify me of major findings. In that 7 months, I was contacted 4 times by the investigation team, twice by data request, asking for my documentation on the 45 transfers, and twice by interview. A compliance analyst who asked careful questions and wrote down my answers with the concentration of someone who understood that the record had to be airtight before the referral went to the prosecutors. The investigation expanded from Haveth outward. 2 additional brokers connected to the same network. A third foster care authority in a different sector operating on the same model. A destination-side labor contractor who had been managing the dependent classification intake at 2 of the 4 work colonies, making sure the children arrived under documentation that suppressed the transfer origin details. The contractor had records going back 4 years. 43 children total when they mapped the full network, not 32 as I had initially flagged, but 43, because the network had been operating before Haveth became the primary broker. Haveth was the most recent and most active arm, but it had predecessors. 38 children were in work colonies when the investigation found them. 5 were still in the transit pipeline at 3 different stations, and the investigation intercept pulled them before their transfers completed. Those 5 were placed in welfare custody immediately. I received a notification on each intercept. Brief, formal, no names, transfer reference, intercept date, welfare placement confirmed. 5 notifications over 2 months. I read each one and went back to work. In the end, they identified a network of 3 foster care authorities, 2 brokers, and a destination-side labor contractor, all operating through the same legal framework my 2015 memo had described. 43 children total in the network, going back 4 years, 38 in work colonies, 5 intercepted. Havath Transit Solutions and its associated entities were decertified. The principals faced criminal referral under the compact's anti-trafficking statutes. The 3 foster authorities were dissolved, and their license holders barred from any licensed welfare role in the compact system for life. A bar I had not known was available until the investigation team's final notification mentioned it. It was in an obscure provision of the CTA welfare charter. Someone at the IG's office had looked for it, specifically, which told me something about the people doing that work. The IG's office also recommended, in a footnote of their final report, that Form CTA 14A7 be required as a system-verified completed document rather than a reference number, and that origin point verification be added to the Section 14 Article 9 process. They cited my 2015 memo. 11 years late, but there. I was not in the courtroom. I was not in the IG's final briefing. I was behind my counter at Hangar 9 making soup when the notification came through on my station terminal. I read it, noted it, and finished making the soup because there were 40 people in the waiting area who needed to eat. That is the work. You do not stop doing the work because something else has also happened. 6 months after the investigation closed, a woman came through Morn Relay Station on a family reconnection transit. She was Keth, ridge-eared, ash-gray skin, the silver hair that most adult Keth women wore long. She had 2 forms of identification, a travel authorization and a welfare case number, and she came to the processing desk and asked to speak with whoever had filed the welfare hold on a Keth child the previous year. Transfer reference CT 9942-14A. Davitt sent her to me. She was a craft worker, I learned. She had been separated from Kess during a displacement event, the kind that happens along border moons when transit authorities decide to process refugee status reviews on a batch basis, and families get sorted into different queues. She had been looking since the day they were separated. She had 2 things: the welfare case number, which had eventually found its way to her through the reconnection network, and the name of the person on the record. My name. She stood at my counter, and she was not in tears because the Keth don't cry, but her ears were full back, the posture of someone who has been braced against something for a very long time and is not sure yet whether it's safe to stop. She was thin in the way of someone who has been traveling hard, and her hands on the counter had the calluses of a person who works with tools, and she asked me what had happened to her daughter. I told her all of it. The hold, the documentation, the investigation, the welfare intake, the bird. I told it the way I would tell it in a record, in order, factually, without softening the parts that had been close. She deserved to know how close it had been. When I said the bird, something in her face changed. The bracing shifted. She put her hand over her mouth, a human gesture, I noted, probably learned from years around human aid workers, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Kess had the bird when she came into the system. She had it all morning, I said. She held it the whole time. She was quiet again. I carved it before we were separated, she said. Her trade dialect was accented but precise. I wanted her to have something from me if I didn't know how long. I carved her name in it, and mine, so she would know both our names. I know, I said. I read them. I put both names in the record. She looked at me for a long time. Then she reached across the counter and put her hand over mine, both hands, the Keth gesture that meant kept safe, the same one Kess had made at the kitchen door. I let my hand stay there for a moment. I am not much for gestures, usually, but she had been looking for a year and a half, and she deserved that, I thought, to have someone stand still for a moment and receive it. Where is she? She asked. Welfare case will have the placement details. The welfare officer is Rena Cole. She's good, she knows the case. She'll help you with the reconnection process. Her office is on the upper level, second corridor left. She straightened. The ears came up from their brace position, not all the way, but upward. The posture of someone who has been told where to go next. "Thank you," she said. "Go," I said. "Don't waste time here." She went. I finished the morning service and cleaned down the counter and restocked the condiment shelf and started the prep for the afternoon soup. The station went about its business around me. Arrivals, departures, the slow churn of transit. There are always more people coming through. There are always more waiting. I found out later, through the welfare office, that the reconnection was completed 6 weeks after the mother arrived at morn. Kess had been in a station-side welfare placement, stable, attentive. The placement officer's notes described her as quiet and cooperative, and in possession of a carved wooden bird she refused to set down. When her mother came through the welfare office door, the note said, she looked at the door for a long moment before she moved. Then she crossed the room and her mother picked her up and the note said, quiet, both of them very quiet. I was not there to see it. That was not my part of the story. My part was the morning, the 6 a.m. counter, the cold corridor, the child sitting alone with her hands in her lap, the thread that started with a wrongly filed form and ended with a name in a record where it needed to be. There are 43 children in that record. For 38 of them I was too late, the pipeline had completed, the transfers were done, and unwinding them was the long work of the IG investigation and the courts. Some of those cases resolved well. Some are still ongoing. I don't have full visibility into the outcomes and I try not to pretend I do. For one of them, I was in time. For one of them, in 9 hours between the wrong form being accepted and the broker arriving to complete the transfer, somebody happened to know exactly which thread to pull. That is not enough. I know that. 43 children and I was there for one of them, and I had written a memo 11 years earlier that nobody acted on, and there are pipelines running through every transit system in the compact, and I am one retired logistics officer running a soup counter. But she had the bird. She held it all morning and she never let go of it, and when she left she showed it to me one last time because she wanted me to know that she understood what the morning had been, and I understood what she was telling me, and it was enough to carry. I have worked the hot meal counter at Hangar 9 for 11 years. I will probably work it for several more. The supply manifests come in every morning and the soup gets made, and the waiting areas fill up and empty out and fill up again with the ordinary traffic of people moving between places. And I keep my station credentials current, and I know every applicable code in the compact transit handbook. And the terminal at my counter has the same read access to the transit log that every aid worker on the station has. I do not carry the work with me when I go home at night. But I am here every morning before the heating grid catches up. I have been here every morning for 11 years. I will be here tomorrow. Some problems you solve with force, some you solve with endurance. Some you solve by knowing, after 22 years of filing, exactly where the gap is and exactly which form closes it, and by being the one person in the building who remembers writing the memo. She held the bird out at me on that first morning before she decided whether to trust me, and she pointed it forward, the way you point something toward a direction, and I understood. Forward that way. I went.